So, in the years following the Civil War in Lexington's East End, around that track, what you see is a real strong emergence. In the first, really 5 to 10 years, the population doubled around that track after the Civil War, and a lot of young men who learned their horsemanship skills during enslavement took what they knew and applied it into the market as free people. And they did so with a lot of success. So much so that in the neighborhoods that surrounded that old KA track after the Civil War, we see an emergence of a black middle class before we really start to see it in other southern towns. We also see a lot of comparative wealth in the neighborhoods that surrounded the track, with the owners, the breeders, those headline-making jockeys, the record-breaking jockeys of the late 1800s. So many of them set up their shops, their homes, their stables in Lexington's East End, and they were able to do so because of the vicinity of that track. But all of this 30 to 40 years following the Civil War of comparative opportunity, the closer we get to 1900, the more and more we see systemically those opportunities being removed. So the most visible, the most lucrative roles in the industry of again, these headline-making jockeys, these record-setting owners and breeders and trainers, a lot of those roles that had been the norm for them in terms of what they sought for opportunity moving forward in their careers, a lot of those opportunities were the exact opportunities that began to disappear. And that wasn't coincidental, that was very intentional. So systemically, structurally, those high-earning, headline-making jobs really started to lessen in the community. So what we see then is a shift to a lot more in the way of backside work, a lot of workers at farms, and that reality of that backside work being the bread and butter of a lot of the next generation after 1900 here in the bluegrass and throughout the South. That really is that's the trend that remains and for decades until we get to the civil rights movement, where getting your license to train, being able to legally own a racehorse, being able to get your license to ride, where if you were a black person, those opportunities started to loosen up and started to present again. But it really was decades of primarily backside work. But that backside work on these Kentucky farms and farms throughout the South, and really across the country, backside at tracks as well, that would have been the backbone of the industry. It's just those folks were not as likely to remember their names. They weren't as likely to make headlines, and they certainly weren't earning what the generation or two before them had earned. A good example of somebody who made his way despite the lack of opportunities that were a generation or two before him would be Will Harbut. Will Harbut would have been working with the stallions at several farms before he was employed to work at Faraway farm. He began to oversee the care of Man-O-War in addition to several other stallions standing at that farm. And Will Harbut's relationship with Man-O-War in particular, but his stallions in general, really was quite special in that, for whatever reason, his charisma, his ability to tell a story, little by little, for the first time really ever, we start to see people routinely show up at this farm, at Faraway Farm. Now, this wasn't a time where you like today, it's just so customary for us to show up at these farms and book tours and have these entertainment, education kind of experiences. That was not the norm then at all. That's not even what people would begin to associate with a farm. It was a place of work. But little by little, people heard, there's a groom out of Faraway Farm. And why don't you go take a listen? Why don't you go take a watch? Because the stories that he tells about that horse and others and his relationship and his skill with those horses is unbelievable just to sit back and watch. So I like to think that Will Harbut in many ways did pioneer that kind of concept, of this early concept of a farm tour. And Clem Brooks also would have done the same thing after Will, out at Spendthrift Farm, with really prominent sires. First Nashua, and then later Seattle Slew. So there were men and women who in the 1900s did kind of break through and make a name for themselves in this industry. But as a whole, those would have been, the exception to the rule.